let's dive into this one. We're taking a look at the 100-Year Marathon by Michael Pillsbury. Should be pretty relevant for you, as a junior naval officer, since it's all about China's strategy to kind of, well, become the big guy on the world stage.
Yeah, this book really gets you thinking. Pillsbury, he's got like decades of experience in intelligence, and he's basically saying that China's playing a much longer game than most folks in the West realize. Way more strategic.
So, no quick wins, huh? More like a marathon.
Exactly. And that's where the title comes in, the 100-Year Marathon. His whole argument is that China's got this plan, this century-long plan to replace the U.S. as the top global power. And their target, 2049, the centenary of the People's Republic.
Okay, so that's not just some far-off date, huh? I mean, that's something you could be dealing with directly in your career.
Oh, absolutely. By 2049, you're going to be a seasoned officer, probably making some pretty big decisions that'll be impacted by this whole U.S.-China rivalry. So understanding how China plans to get there, well, it's crucial. Because it's not the kind of straightforward competition we're used to.
Right. And one of the big things Pillsbury tackles is this idea that, as China's economy grows, it'll become more democratic.
Yeah, a lot of people thought that. Like, economic freedom would automatically lead to political freedom. But Pillsbury kind of throws cold water on that idea.
So what's their model then?
He calls it authoritarian capitalism. Think about it from a naval perspective, right? Let's say you're negotiating, a maritime border dispute with a Chinese admiral. They've got all this economic power backing them up, but they're not answering to voters the way leaders in the West do.
Yeah. That changes things, doesn't it?
Completely changes the whole dynamic.
It's like, I don't know, playing chess with someone whose motivations are totally different from yours.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of strategy, Pillsbury talks about this ancient Chinese concept. It's called Xi.
Xi, yeah. It's about strategic advantage, momentum, knowing when to push and when to hold back. It's almost like a martial art, but applied to geopolitics.
And he's saying that China's using Xi today.
Oh, yeah. He argues that they are. Look at what they're doing in the South China Sea, the island building, the military deployments. It's all about shifting the balance of power little by little, making it riskier to challenge them. Each move is carefully calculated, building towards those long-term goals.
Okay, but wouldn't that kind of action tip the U.S. off? I mean, aren't they risking showing their hand too early?
That's where the deception comes in. Pillsbury argues that China's really good at concealing their true intentions. He's even got a saying for it. Never ask the weight of the emperor's cauldrons. Basically, keep your real strength hidden until the right moment.
So it's not just about military might then. It's also about, managing perceptions.
Absolutely. And to show this, to kind of illustrate it, Pillsbury, he dives into the Tiananmen Square massacre back in '89. He's not so much focused on the event itself, but more on how China used it, use it to shape perceptions, both inside China and internationally.
Yeah, the way he describes the different interpretations of that event was really interesting. I mean, in the West, we saw it as a tragedy, right? A setback for democracy. But China spun it as foreign interference, as an attempt to, undermine their rise.
Exactly. And think about that in relation to your career. You'll be dealing with information from all sorts of sources. Some of it might be manipulated, right?
You got to be careful.
Yeah, you need to develop a critical eye, learn to question narratives, figure out those underlying motivations. Those skills, they're going to be crucial.
It's like needing a radar that can see through fog or something.
Yeah.
And to kind of drive home this point about controlling the narrative, Pillsbury introduces these characters, Mr. White and Mrs. Green.
Mr. White, he's based on a real Chinese defector. And Mrs. Green, she's more of a composite character, representing how China tries to, carefully craft its image.
It's all about image, right?
Yeah, and it's not just about propaganda either. Pillsbury claims that China's intelligence services are directly involved in boosting their economic growth, which is pretty different from how Western intelligence agencies operate.
So their economic and strategic goals are, totally intertwined.
Exactly, it's all connected.
So it's not just military stuff or economic deals. It's about shaping the whole, the whole game board. But how does that translate into actual military strategy? That's where Pillsbury gets into what he calls the assassin's mace, right?
Right, the assassin's mace. It's about how China plans to counter U.S. military superiority, but not through direct confrontation. They're looking to exploit vulnerabilities. They're investing heavily in what we call asymmetric capabilities.
So instead of trying to match the U.S. Navy ship for ship, they're developing, what, weapons and tactics that can disrupt our operations, target our weaknesses.
Yeah, exactly. Things like anti-ship ballistic missiles, sophisticated cyber warfare capabilities. These are real threats, not just theoretical. Pillsbury even describes this war game where he played as China and actually managed to defeat a U.S. carrier battle group.
Wow, using those same tactics.
Yep, it was a big wake-up call for the Pentagon.
So China's got this long-term plan, right? And they're playing this whole perception game. Oh, and they're developing some serious military tech, too. What's the U.S. supposed to do?
Yeah.
Well, Pillsbury, he doesn't just, like, sound the alarm. He gives 12 specific steps he thinks the U.S. should take to kind of, counter China's ambitions. It's caused some debate, for sure, but it's worth exploring, right? Especially for you as you build your career in the Navy.
Definitely. It gives us a framework to think about this challenge, and some of his recommendations could have, well, pretty direct implications for the kinds of operations you might be involved in down the road.
Okay, so step one. Seems pretty straightforward. Stop aiding China's military buildup. He's saying that the U.S. has, often unintentionally, given assistance that actually strengthens China's military, right?
Yeah, he points to things like scientific exchanges, where researchers might share information that, well, that could be used for military purposes, or dual-use technologies. Those are things that have both civilian and military uses. Even some economic aid packages could end up benefiting their military.
Makes you think about the ripple effects,
Yeah.
Like even routine stuff can have these big consequences.
Totally. And his second step follows that same logic. He says we need to end China's access to America's national labs. He claims they've been exploiting these labs to, get access to sensitive research and technology, stuff that can enhance their military programs.
That's a serious accusation, isn't it? He's saying there have been cases of espionage, intellectual property theft, even direct technology transfer going on.
Yeah, he is. And it raises questions about security protocols, how we protect our cutting-edge research and who we allow access to. Even collaborations that seem purely scientific can impact national security.
Okay, so step three, stop all Chinese acquisitions of U.S. high-tech companies. He says these acquisitions are, well, they're often more than just business deals. They're a way for China to acquire technology and expertise that can, boost their military.
Think about it strategically, right? Say a Chinese company acquires a U.S. firm that specializes in artificial intelligence or drone technology. Well, that tech could be integrated into their military programs, maybe give them an edge in areas that are vital for naval operations.
So we're not just talking about protecting American jobs. We're talking about protecting our technological advantage.
Exactly.
Okay, step four. This gets into finance a little bit. Pillsbury says we need to curtail China's access to Wall Street. He argues that they've been using Wall Street to, well, raise capital, invest in strategic industries, even manipulate their currency.
It's about recognizing that finance and geopolitics, they're not separate things. China's access to our financial system, it can be a tool to advance their goals. And Pillsbury argues that we need to be a lot more cautious about, how we allow them to participate.
He's saying we can't just treat this as a purely economic issue, right? We got to see those strategic implications.
Yeah.
Okay, step five. Another big point of contention. He says we need to challenge China's trade violations and intellectual property theft, like head on.
Yeah, this is a constant source of friction between the U.S. and China. Pillsbury argues that China has systematically violated international trade rules, dumped subsidized goods, manipulated its currency, and engaged in a lot of intellectual property theft.
He's pretty critical of how past U.S. administrations have handled this. He says they've been too lenient, too willing to just kind of overlook these violations to keep the economic engagement going.
He is, but some people would argue that China's economic growth is more a result of globalization, not deliberate manipulation.
Right.
There's definitely a debate to be had there, but Pillsbury's point is that we can't be naive. We have to hold China accountable, make sure there's a level playing field, and, protect American businesses and workers.
Okay. Step six takes us into the world of information. He says we need to expose and counter China's global propaganda offensive. He's arguing that they're running a sophisticated campaign to control the narrative, to shape global perceptions in their favor, and to undermine U.S. influence.
It's a battle for hearts and minds, a fight for influence and credibility. We have to recognize that information itself is a weapon, and China's using it strategically.
So it's not just about military hardware or economic power, it's about winning the information war too.
Exactly.
And step 7 kind of ties into this. He says we need to expose China's cyber warfare program. He's saying they've developed massive cyber warfare capabilities, very sophisticated, and they pose a serious threat to the U.S.
Think about what that means for naval operations. Cyber attacks could disrupt communications, compromise navigation systems. They could even disable weapon systems. It's a whole new domain of warfare, and it's one the Navy has to be ready for.
It's like an invisible battlefield, isn't it? Where the lines between peace and war get really blurry. Now, step 8 is a little more controversial. Pillsbury says we need to help Taiwan defend itself. He argues that Taiwan is a key flashpoint in this whole U.S.-China rivalry and that we need to give them the military support they need to deter a potential Chinese invasion.
Yeah, that's a sensitive issue for sure. There's potential for things to escalate. But Pillsbury sees Taiwan as a test case for U.S. credibility and resolve. He argues that if we don't stand with Taiwan, well, it sends a message to our other allies that we might not be there for them either.
So it's about more than just Taiwan itself. It's about sending a message to the whole region. Okay, Pillsbury's 9th step is about strengthening our Asian alliances.
Right. He says we need to build a network of strong alliances in Asia to counter China's growing influence. He sees it as a key element of containment, a way to stop China from becoming too dominant and to maintain a balance of power in the region.
So we need to work with partners who share our interests and our values.
Yeah.
We can't go it alone. Step 10 is a call to action for the U.S. government itself. He says we need a new government agency focused on China.
He argues that our current government structure is too fragmented, too slow-moving to really deal with the complexity of this challenge. He wants a new agency, kind of like the National Security Council, but dedicated to developing and coordinating a comprehensive China strategy.
So it's about streamlining things, getting everyone on the same page, having a clear and unified approach to dealing with China. And step 11, it's all about awareness.
Yeah.
Pillsbury says we need to educate the American public about China's ambitions.
Yeah, he argues that most Americans just aren't aware of the scale and the scope of the challenge China presents. He wants a public awareness campaign to inform people about China's goals, their strategies, and what it all means for the U.S.
He's saying we can't have an effective strategy if the public isn't on board, right? If they don't understand what's at stake. Okay, his final step, step 12, is about bringing jobs back to the U.S. He says we need to, rebuild America's manufacturing base. He argues that letting American manufacturing decline has weakened our economy and made us more dependent on China.
He sees it as both an economic and a national security issue. A strong manufacturing base is vital for innovation, for job creation, for, reducing our reliance on potential adversaries. He wants to see those jobs back here, contributing to our strength and our resilience.
So there you have it, 12 steps. Some are really specific policy recommendations, and some are more about, big strategic shifts. What do you think?
So we've gone through those 12 steps that Pillsbury lays out, how the U.S. should deal with China's rise. But it's important to remember that not everyone agrees with his book, right? It's gotten some criticism, too. We should talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. There are definitely people who think he's painting too alarming a picture of China, focusing too much on the worst-case scenarios.
Like it's inevitable that we'll clash.
Right. And they say he doesn't give enough weight to the potential for, cooperation.
So instead of this big showdown, they see room for both countries to succeed.
Exactly. They point to things like climate change, global trade, preventing nuclear proliferation as areas where cooperation could actually benefit both the U.S. and China.
Makes sense. I mean, we're all facing those global challenges together, right? Exactly. We're all in this together, in a way. And another critique is that Pillsbury relies a bit too much on anecdotal evidence, particularly from Chinese defectors.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, critics question how reliable those sources really are. Do they have their own agendas? Is the information they're giving, is it outdated? Could it even be inaccurate?
Right. It's like relying on intel from just one source. You got to verify, cross-reference.
Exactly. You need that wider perspective, especially when you're making, big strategic decisions.
Another criticism I've heard is that Pillsbury might be underestimating the challenges China faces internally. Things like corruption, environmental problems, social unrest. their slowing economy.
Those are all valid points. China's not this unstoppable machine with a perfect plan. They've got their own internal struggles to deal with, and those could definitely impact their ability to achieve their ambitions.
It's like thinking about the morale of a crew,
Right.
right? Even with the best ship, the best technology, if the crew's facing problems, it's going to affect how they perform. And some critics also aren't crazy about Pillsbury's solutions. They say he's too confrontational and that, his approach could make things worse. It could escalate tensions between the U.S. and China.
It's a tough balancing act. On one hand, you got to stand your ground, protect your interests, but pushing too hard for confrontation could backfire.
Right? It's like navigating a narrow strait. You need a steady hand and a good understanding of the currents.
Exactly. Finding that sweet spot between competition and cooperation, that's key. You need to be able to push back when you have to, but also be open to finding common ground when it's beneficial for both sides.
So the big takeaway here is don't get caught up in a single narrative. The U.S.-China relationship, it's this mix of competition, cooperation, even interdependence. It needs a flexible approach, informed, not rigid.
And that's where your training and experience as a naval officer come in. You're developing those skills to analyze information, to see through propaganda, to make good judgments, even when things are uncertain. Those skills will be more and more valuable in a world shaped by China's rise.
Well, this deep dive into the 100-year marathon has given us a lot to think about. I hope you'll keep exploring these ideas, keep asking questions, and, most importantly, keep learning. The future of naval operations, heck, the entire global landscape, will be shaped by how this U.S.-China rivalry plays out. And you, as a future leader in the Navy, have a role to play in shaping that future.